I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
(1942). The world was at war. The Nazi threat in Europe and the Japanese terror in the Pacific had sparked a worldwide conflict. An attack on the naval base at Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the war. Young men from all over the United States were called to fight for their country. Some were sent to Europe, others to the Pacific. From the Midwest came some of the most determined men to fight in the Pacific. These were the men of the Wisconsin National Guard, the 32nd Infantry Division, and this is their story. Few people would think of Watertown as an important city in world history, but men from this small Wisconsin town were members of the 32nd Division and took part in one of the most intense Pacific campaigns in World War II. The 32nd Division organized during World War I, when the entire Wisconsin National Guard, including those from Watertown, joined with the Michigan National Guard. The 32nd were the first American troops to set foot on German soil during World War I.
The 32nd Division is a legacy in Wisconsin. Of course, it was formed back in 1917, before they went to World War I. And that's where they earned in Europe the title of the Les Terribles by the French people, by the French military, because they were such fierce fighters. That legacy has carried through to World War II. There is no division, I do not believe, in the military. This was a National Guard unit. This was not regular Army. They were National Guard hometown men that went to fight. And they fought valiantly, so that the 32nd has become first and foremost in the minds of, or it should, in the minds of the people of this state.
The war was a stalemate. The Allies and the Axis powers bogged down in trenches. But once they landed in Europe, the 32nd was able to pierce through the Germans' Hindenburg Line. They earned the nickname the Red Arrow Division and adopted their Red Arrow patch. They returned home as heroes, confident that the war they had fought would end all wars. World War II began in 1939. The United States remained neutral until late 1941, but the government began to prepare the military for combat during those 2 years. The 32nd Division modernized and reorganized. Cavalry units converted to artillery units. In 1940, the Watertown National Guard unit became Battery F, 126th Artillery Regiment of the 32nd.
They thought it prudent, I guess I could say, to start a draft and also to call up the National Guard, which was considered to be the kind of first line of defense. The National Guard divisions, since they're already organized, already had some informal training on a part-time basis, they were considered to be the units that could first be sent out into combat while the massive citizen army, draftee army, was being recruited, trained, equipped, prepared for battle further along.
Preparations became more serious when the military began training. The 32nd transferred to several different camps, ending up at Camp Livingston in Louisiana. Here they participated in the Louisiana Maneuvers, the largest training maneuvers ever done in the United States. A reporter from Life magazine described the battle.
The attack had come before dawn. With two fast-moving, hard-hitting armored divisions leading the way, Lieutenant General Ben Lear, commander of the Second Army, had pushed his troops across the muddy Red River and was already sending long tentacles down the highways to the south, where Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's Third Army lay in wait. Overhead, armadas of pursuit planes fought great dogfights, while sleek A-20A attack bombers and Navy dive bombers strafed the columns of tanks and trucks moving up to the front.
The military trained all through the summer and fall of 1941, still several months before the U.S. entered the war. If and when the president declared war, the 32nd would be ready, or so they thought.
There were two divisions to choose from. He decided, based on his very misinformed intelligence, that he would send the 32nd not because it was the most prepared, but because it was the least prepared. They were going to have to move again to train for jungle warfare if they didn't go to New Guinea. He said, well, let's get them their training in New Guinea, fighting the Japanese.
December 7th, 1941. The United States was now at war. Troops shipped out daily. In early 1942, the 32nd, under the command of Brigadier General Edwin F. Harding, waited to head off to Europe and go fight the Nazis.
They thought at that point in time that they were going to Germany. That's what their training was. Their training was to go to Germany and fight there. In Washington, it was decided by the War Department that instead of them going to Germany, they were going to go to the Pacific.
Their mission? To protect Australia from the Japanese. Japanese soldiers would rather die than surrender, and they would take as many enemies with them as they could before they did. Their cruelty toward captured soldiers was well known. This was the enemy the 32nd would face. On April 22nd, 1942, the 32nd sailed from San Francisco. 3 weeks later, they arrived at Port Adelaide, Australia. For the next several months, they transferred between camps, eventually reaching Camp Cable in Brisbane. Travel was tiring, and the soldiers began to lose what little preparation they had.
In late 1942, the 32nd spent 5 of the preceding 7 months in transit. 5 of them, either on trains, on ships, or in barracks, waiting to be shipped somewhere. So that's 5 months when the edge is wearing off anyone. You're not in shape, you're losing shape, you're not in training. So physically, as well as mentally, you're probably losing your edge.
Whether they had lost their edge or not, General Douglas MacArthur still expected the 32nd to fight. MacArthur was the supreme commander of the U.S. forces in the Pacific. He had been in the Philippines for many years before the war. When the Japanese forced him to abandon the Philippines in early 1942, he vowed to reclaim the islands. His plan for the U.S. offensive in the Pacific centered on taking back the Philippines. To do this, the U.S. troops had to maintain control of Australia. But the battle for Australia did not come on the continent itself.
MacArthur decided we weren't going to wait on the beaches for the Japanese to come to us. We were going to fight them in New Guinea. The side that could control New Guinea would control that whole area around New Zealand, Australia, and so on. And we could begin our march back up to the Philippines by first taking New Guinea.
Lying just north of Australia, New Guinea is among the world's largest islands.
You know, MacArthur, who had escaped from the Philippines to Australia, said, we're stripped here. We're stripped of people to defend Australia. The Japanese had taken Indochina. They'd beaten the French in Indochina, the British at Singapore. They'd beaten the Dutch in Indonesia, what later became Indonesia. They'd beaten us in the Philippines. Our army had ultimately surrendered to them in the Philippines. And so there was nothing standing between the approaching Japanese and Australia except this big kind of lizard-shaped island north of Australia, New Guinea.
Dense jungle, thick swamps, mountain peaks, and deep valleys covered the landscape. The climate was hot and humid, and the rainy season was just beginning. Maps of the island were poor, and gathering intelligence was extremely difficult. MacArthur believed that only a few thousand poorly trained Japanese soldiers occupied New Guinea. In reality, 16,000 Japanese troops waited for them on the island. They were veterans of the war in China, Indochina, and Singapore, and had been building up their defenses for months. Defeating them would not be easy. MacArthur turned to the 32nd for the invasion force. General Harding, commander of the 32nd, protested. The 32nd had not trained for jungle warfare, but MacArthur insisted there was no alternative. They would have to learn on the job. He ordered them to New Guinea. The 32nd arrived in Port Moresby completely unprepared.
It was amazing, but they used ammunition and weapons from World War I until the war effort could get geared up and they could get sufficient. So this was the first major battle as far as the South Pacific was concerned.
The 126th, the unit from Watertown, was among those chosen to march across the island. Their chosen route was the Kappa Kappa Trail, a little-known, little-used trail that wound through 130 miles of dense jungle over the Owen-Stanley Mountains. The natives called them the Ghost Mountains.
The trip of the 126th over the Owen-Stanley Mountains is actually a horror story. These men were asked to go through territory that had literally been that white men had not crossed.
Over 900 men left from the village of Kappa Kappa on October 14th, 1942. They hired natives to help carry their supplies and guide them over the mountains.
They're going up 8,000 feet. And then they get to the top, and it's described as the most eeriest thing that they had ever seen. And there was not even a sound there, not even a bird.
Disease was the greatest enemy in the Ghost Mountains. Because of the trail's terrible condition, they had to abandon most of their supplies. There was little medicine to treat the sick, and what they had was worthless.
A rule went out among the troops that you don't get evacuated unless you have a 104-degree temperature. So you stay in the line and do the best you can.
Any quinine that they would have for malaria, any medication whatsoever, all of that, because of the high humidity, just dissolved.
After 42 days, the 126th made it to the end of the trail. Miraculously, the unit had only 20 casualties and 1 death. They had accomplished what few other humans had. They had crossed the Ghost Mountains, but their greatest test was yet to come. After their trek across the mountains, the 32nd Division was incredibly weakened. 70% of the men had malaria. Others suffered from jungle foot rot. Some had barely made it to the end of the trail. Now that they had made it across the mountains, they had to attack the Japanese entrenched at Buna. After only 7 days' rest, they flew to the front lines to attack the Japanese. The U.S. and Australian troops at the front had been attacking the beachheads for days. When the 32nd arrived, they joined with the 16th Brigade, causing confusion among the soldiers and commanders. A more daunting obstacle was the Japanese defenses.
The 32nd found when they got there was that far from being a few hundred tail enders, there are about 16,000 Japanese, many of them veterans of the war in China, Indochina, Singapore, who had been brought in to strengthen the defenses in that area. And not only were there strong veteran troops, but they'd had months to build up a very elaborate series of defenses around their perimeter. His troops were being, in effect, channeled down these trails toward a killing zone, no matter how they approached. He had 3 battalions. He just had 3 battalions to work with initially. One on the far east side and 2 on the west side. And no matter how they approached the Japanese defenses, the Japanese had prepared those channels of approach so that the attackers had no chance whatsoever.
Japanese reinforcements began to arrive. The American troops had few supplies and little intelligence about their enemy. MacArthur ordered General Harding to attack and to do it quickly.
In World War I, there were masses of troops that were just fed in kind of assembly line fashion into a meat grinder, the trenches. And our leaders who had studied the war and people around the world who had studied the war said, we just can't do that anymore. We had to come up with a different way of fighting that didn't just destroy people with nothing gained. And there were 3 lessons that are very important, at least from my point of view. One was, he said, no longer can we throw people away, send riflemen forward to attack positions that are well dug in, well defended, without proper weaponry and without proper support. There must be artillery, there must be an opportunity to maneuver and deceive the enemy. We can't just attack them head on. That's just, as he said, it adds to the butcher's bill.
Harding obeyed. The soldiers would attack at 1300 hours following an air raid. One soldier remembers.
The air attack by A-20s and B-25s came in around 1600. It was not a success. Most of the planes couldn't even find the target area. One flight dropped its bombs into the sea, and one B-25 got a direct hit on companies B and C of the 128th, killing 6, wounding 12, and seriously affecting the will to fight of the whole battalion. The Japanese positions were virtually untouched, and the attacks against them were easily repulsed with heavy casualties.
The defeat split the 32nd between two fronts, the Urbana and the Warren. MacArthur grew impatient with them and criticized their tactics. Days passed, but the division still made no progress. MacArthur relieved General Harding of his command, replacing him with Lieutenant General Eichelberger.
He relieved General Harding from his duties in Buna because he said the 32nd men were soft and they were not doing the job. And so he sent General Eichelberger over there to take over from General Harding. And he told Eichelberger that if he didn't win that battle over there in Buna, he shouldn't come back. That's how unmerciless this was.
After sorting out the mixed-up divisions and improving the supply line, Eichelberger launched his attack. On December 18th, troops on the Urbana front attacked the Buna. They broke through the Japanese lines, allowing supplies to reach the American troops. The Urbana force discovered the rest of the Japanese hiding in a coconut grove southeast of Buna. With 350 men remaining in the battalion, 100 of them were sent into the grove to attack the Japanese. After a long, tiresome battle, the Japanese were forced to retreat even further. The Urbana and Warren forces reunited on New Year's Day. Together, they forced the Japanese to surrender on January 2nd, 1943.
It's a savage battle. And our men are outnumbered. The weapons were far superior that the Japanese had, so that their odds were, it was tremendous odds against them. And as I read and studied, not only in Buna, but throughout, particularly the Pacific War, but in Europe also, that without two things, without the fortitude of the American soldier and the bravery of the American soldier, and then the grace of God, that we won that war.
The men of the 126th and the 32nd Division as a whole overcame all obstacles and completed their mission. They secured New Guinea and prevented a Japanese attack on Australia. Poor supplies, inadequate equipment, disease, and fatigue could not take away their courage. Before the end of the war, they served in 3 other major campaigns with the same spirit and valor they showed in New Guinea. The victories of the National Guard 32nd Division are not as well known as those of the men who landed on the beaches of Normandy or who fought on Iwo Jima, but their sacrifice and heroism were just as great. Sadly, few people today know about the Ghost Mountains or the Battle of Buna.
The dedication, the sacrifices, the legacy that they have left us, that we here might go free from the oppression of those, of the enemy, both the Japanese, who were out to conquer all of the South Pacific. They were, the Japanese were fierce fighters. They would die before they would surrender. They would commit suicide in many cases before they would surrender. So that our men faced this fierce fighting enemy with all the courage, with all the strength that they had. And so Wisconsin is indebted to these men. And then, of course, that legacy has continued through to this day. Even though the division itself, it's now the 32nd brigade, that 32nd Division is still intact, and it's something we should be proud of.
Their legacy must never be forgotten. We must tell their story.
The reason that the 32nd Division has not received the notoriety that it should have, or the recognition, is that we haven't told the story. Maybe we should do a better job of telling the story.